farm in Anatolia, a center experiencing tens of thousands of years of agricultural and horticultural history. Berries and nuts were the major food sources for the Canterans. Ms. Ceren Kabuku will tell us their story based upon their excavations. So please welcome Ceren and leave the floor over to the topic Origins and Evolution of Early Farming in Southwestern Asia.
Just get used to my fancy headset first. I'd like to thank the organizing committee of IHC and everybody else for actually inviting me, because I am suddenly surrounded by serious scientists who know about how to grow plants, and I'm actually an archaeologist. So thanks for having me. I'm going to tell you a story today about how people started messing with plants, how they decided to grow them, maybe a little bit about their later developments, but I'll have to stay a little bit in the earlier part because I've only got 20-25 minutes and I'd need about 3 hours. As people before me have said, Anatolia has a very deep history of plant use and early farming. But I'll first tell you about what I actually do. I look at bits of plants that have at some point in their lives burnt, but not necessarily completed combustion, so they stay as sort of incomplete burnt products, and they get deposited in soil. And archaeologists excavate the soil, we put it through water, and whatever floats to the top we collect. So these are the plants that I actually study. So I look at burnt bits of seeds, wood, tubers, anything that can actually survive this process. So just to have a picture in your mind of what I'm actually going to talk about. At the top, I have examples of wild barley that are from archaeological sites, and at the bottom, what it looks like in actual modern samples. So sadly, I don't really get genetic preservation, but everything else pretty much stays. So we can actually do identification on one-on-one comparisons, which is fantastic when you're trying to figure out if something is wild or domesticated, or if it's in the process of becoming domesticated, or if there are land races forming. So through a good deal of examination, we can actually get to a lot of detail with archaeological examinations of plant remains. But in my talk today, I'm going to take you through some of what happens in Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, and I'll focus mostly on Southwest Asia, so this bit of Anatolia, parts of the Near East, and then just a little bit of the Eastern Mediterranean, just to give you a heads up. So when people talk about hunter-gatherers, especially Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, there's this misconception that they rely mostly on meat. Okay? There's this whole fad of the paleo diet. People will tell you, oh, they went after a lot of big game. That is just a gross misconception. Okay? There's no such thing. We've got evidence from present-day hunter-gatherers, we've got evidence from prehistoric hunter-gatherers that I'll talk about in a little while. Plants are important, and they are actually what enabled us to evolve and survive in a huge range of environments. And the fact that we could grow them and we could cook them helped us build massive civilizations out of nothing. So, as I said, there is a massive range of Paleolithic plant use, and it starts in, I don't know, 150,000 years ago, parts of Africa. We've got evidence of starch on lithics, on groundstone implements. We've got evidence from parts of Israel and Levant, and also from Turkey, of people harvesting and consuming wild lentils, wild grasses, wild pistachios and almonds. We've also got evidence from elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Southern Mediterranean of people using and cooking wild oats, for example. So the fact that people actually were messing around with all of these plants long before anybody did any farming is quite interesting on its own. Hence why I told you plants allowed us to evolve. There's also evidence from elsewhere in Greece of the Paleolithic that people were not only harvesting and processing wild grasses, but they were also roasting them and cooking them. Which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. But we've also got Paleolithic evidence from Anatolia, from Karaim Cave, which is one of the longest deposits of Paleolithic and Epipaleolithic and later occupation, that people relied on a huge range of plants. So they went after wild pears, wild almonds, figs at some point, I might get to, and all sorts of other things, including some elements of wild grasses and legumes. So there is a rich heritage of people relying on all of these plants. But it takes a while for things to start, well, being recognized by archaeologists, but also by other people. So the next slide I'm going to show you, I'll show you some parts of carbonized food remains from a cave called Shanidar Cave on the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. This is about 30 to 40,000 years ago. But just before I get there, I'll just remind you what lentil palisade cells look like, because this is what we're able to see in this big blob of carbonized plant remain that might not necessarily look like much, but when you look at it a little closer, there are all sorts of tiny fragments of crushed legumes that if you look at them closer, you can start seeing the palisade cells. So one of our challenges within archaeology is to start recognizing the actual deep history of how we've come to start domesticating plants. And it goes at least back some, 30, 40,000 years. So I don't know if everybody can see this, but this is a really long and boring chart of what happens in terms of our relationship with plants. We start with gathering wild wheats, barleys, lentils, peas, etc. And that goes at least, we now know that goes at least 35,000 years ago. Following from this, people start actual permanent settlements. At this stage, all the plants are still wild. At least genotypically, this is what the genetic research is showing, and phenotypically they do look wild as well. And much later, it takes about 4,000 or 5,000 years of people being settled in villages before plants are actually domesticated. So it's an actually long and very protracted process. And sometime during this process, in what we call the pre-Pottery Neolithic A, because there is a pre-Pottery Neolithic B, this is Neolithic villages before they actually had pottery, so they had these stone vessels and massive houses. This is when people start to cultivate, as in planting and harvesting of what looks like morphologically wild cereals and pulses. But that in itself as well takes a long time for the domestication mutations to take effect. So just to remind you, this is what we do to plants in the process of domesticating. We prevent them from being able to spread themselves. In wild grasses and in wild legumes, the ripening pod tends to shatter and disperse. So the seeds are basically spreading themselves out. What we do with farming is we stop that process, so the ripened seed actually stays mostly on the head. There are many mutations that control this process, but the end result, we stop them from going anywhere when they're ready to sprout. The further changes are, as most people will be aware of this, even the person you meet in a grocery store, the wild seeds are small, domesticated ones are much larger. And in many cases that is anywhere between a 3 to 10-fold increase. It's also the ears start to hold more grain on it. So we've basically, over time, geared plants towards serving our needs. It might not be so straightforward, but this is what has happened. But as I said, this process takes a long, long time. So grain size increase from what we know of archaeological sites, it takes anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500 years. So if you were trying to intentionally domesticate or collect or select specific variants, you could easily do this. These people probably had the mind to be able to do it, but it takes a very long time. So this makes us question whether they did it for biodiversity issues, whether they did it as a risk buffering mechanism. Your guess is as good as mine. Sadly, the people that I work on don't really leave behind anything written. There's no guideline for this is why we planted that, that's why we didn't do this. But what we see from so many years of studying these things is it's not straightforward, and they did not necessarily aim to increase seed size or stop the shattering of the seeds. But they did eventually choose to do so, which is interesting on its own. As people before me have said, Anatolia lies in a very, very important position in terms of the origins of agriculture. And not just in terms of the origins of agriculture, but some of the most important crops that we rely on today have their centers of origin in parts of Anatolia, and they have had further mutations following their own initial onset of farming. They've devolved into new crop types that we come to rely today, such as durum wheat, such as red wheat, and a whole host of other crops. And some of the most important areas that people will always talk about are located in Southeast Anatolia. And I'm going to talk to you very quickly, if I'm not running out of time, about a site called Göbekli and some of the sites that are near it. But just before I get there, let me just put you in terms of an orientation of what happens to climate. So there's this idea, some people say, okay, the climate was really, really, really bad. There were people multiplying, they had so much population, they could not feed them, that's why they went into farming. And what we're seeing actually is that farming, or any kind of messing about with plants, starts at the time that we start to see really nice temperatures. Things are coming into what we call the climatic optimum. This is the time period at the beginning of the Holocene when grasses are spreading in the landscape. So it's not necessarily a stress or a risk buffering mechanism that has led them into doing these things to plant, but perhaps the environment was ripe enough and they decided, okay, we can do this as a full-time occupation. Who knows? But at the end of the day, it's a very long and bumpy road. It takes a long time, and in the process, many other things change. Beyond what happens to plants and animals, people change the way they live, people change the way their houses are, people change the way they exist. Everything shifts. So it's not necessarily just about farming, but it does facilitate a lot of things. So as I said, I'm going to talk to you about Göbekli Tepe. This is a quite well-known site with massive monolithic T-shaped pillars that are about 5.5 meters tall. They're cut from individual, single stones. If you try to imagine the amount of labor something like this requires, you think, surely these guys must have been farming. But sadly for us, the PPNA evidence from the site still points to the existence of a lot of wild plants. Other sites that are nearby, so this is Güsürhöyük from pre-Quaternary Neolithic A again. So we're talking about the early to mid-10th millennium calibrated before Christ. So that's roughly 12,000 years ago. And this site as well, which is built on a similar plan to Göbekli and similar building shapes. So this big, massive building in there is 30 meters across. Just to give you an idea. And here as well we have evidence for a lot of wild legumes, a lot of wild grasses, and things are just being built. This kind of labor organization is happening based on a very intensive use of wild plants. And as I said, a lot of the evidence points to this region. So at both the big sites, we've got evidence for wild cereals and wild pulses, and we've got modern genetic evidence that is pointing to Karacadağ, the Gaziantep to Urfa region, as one of the centers of domestication for at least emerine hormones. And what happens following on from people playing with cultivating wild grasses and wild legumes, they start building these massive settlements. So this is from Neolithic Çatalhöyük, where they have this really elaborate symbolism where they bring wild aurochs heads and wild goat heads and put them as benches in their houses. These guys have a very elaborate farming system. They've got everything stored, they have a massive range of plants, they've got all 4 varieties of cereals, all manner of pulses. They probably even cultivate wild mustards. They go after almonds. Everything is happening, and it happens within the space of 300 to 400 years, whereas before that it took tens and thousands of years. But the nice thing about Çatalhöyük, beyond the fact that it's a massive settlement in the middle of Konya, and is probably the best thing you can see around there, is that we've got so much information about what's happening in early farming systems. So we know that they've got an entire package of crops, but they also have an entire package of animals, and this is probably what enables them to keep going. And it's actually quite a large start, so it's 13 hectares in total. But because we also had a number of burnt buildings, we're able to see processing stages, we're able to see how crops were stored and whether they were grown in the same fields or not. So we know that they did their threshing in the field and brought crops to the site to store as whole ears and then cleaned them up from their chaff just before cooking, which is very different to what later agricultural systems do. And we also know that they treated certain crops, like lentils at the top, with their pod fragments at the left-hand side. They treated certain crops differently, so possibly they harvested them at different times, but they also stored a lot of wild edibles together, so they may have been actually going after weeds of cultivation as food quite consciously. So what we know from this site, and more generally from Neolithic cultivation in parts of Turkey and Greece, etc., is they incorporated multiple crops and possibly grew them adjacent or in the same field or in a rotation, but it was very intensive in terms of the use of space. They used manuring, they were weeding all the time. They treated it as if they were doing horticulture in a very limited area. They were not doing the single species planting of these massive fields. They also probably maintain soil fertility, not necessarily through just manuring, but also doing pulse and cereal mixed cropping. And we also have evidence of this in many types of environments across the Mediterranean and Turkey. And gardening is not necessarily limited to gardening for flowers, but also as a viable agri-system in mountain habitats, for example, or where soils are of a limited availability. But we have a little bit more evidence from Çatal. Are you getting bored? Probably. Where we can actually look at weeds of cultivation to try and understand cropping systems. Yes. And it's a simple idea. You look at the weeds that come with a stored crop, and you say, do they prefer dry habitats? Do they prefer wet habitats? Do they like disturbance, etc.? So this allows us to sort of narrow down what's happening in different environments. And if we also look at the isotopes, we can try and understand, okay, are they planting them all in the same field? Are they giving some things more water, some things less water? And at least for the Neolithic, what we're seeing is a lot of things are actually growing in very dry environments, apart from wheat. In many of the settlements, wheat seems to be the queen of all crops and is getting all the water. So Go figure. So I'm going to very, very quickly bring this to an end. I have 5 minutes? Yeah? Okay. And I'll just take you through what happens in the remaining 6 millennia. Not really. What happens when you start to get into urban systems and more developed cultivation regimes and more complex societies is everything is regulated. So in southern and northern Mesopotamia there are field systems. People in the Uruk period were writing to each other and they were telling their friend, I remember your cow, whatever the name of the cow, was ill, I hope she's doing better. It was so important and everything was so regulated that it had no relationship whatsoever to what was happening in Neolithic cultivation, because huge numbers of population for the first time had to be sustained through all this production. Not just that, but warfare had to be supported through this as well. So they had systems for irrigation, garden fields, etc. You name it, they had started doing this single crop plantations, and it's a similar story in northern Mesopotamia, which is closer to our Syria border, but there they had systems for collecting rainwater and actually irrigating fields out of that, and more sort of mobile pastoral populations came about around this time. What happened at this point in time is food also became very regulated. So they started rationing cereals, for example, or cooked bread, and came up with Bronze Age, Iron Age. People started coming up with ways of preserving particularly cereal foods into lasting them longer and also reducing cooking time on an individual basis. Hittites, based in Anatolia, did very similar things. Everything that related to farming, including their field systems, which crops could be grown where, in which combinations, and what could be done with them in terms of where to store them, which beer to make with them, or which bread to make with them, was regulated. If you veered off course, you were pretty much on your own, because it was uncharted territory. So especially during these urban populations and their farming strategies, risk in agriculture and being able to control yield is what scared people into following state regulation. So I find this a very interesting sort of conclusion to what happens in terms of the development of farming in Anatolia. We start by exploring and playing with a lot of wild resources, our rich biodiversity and our heritage, and eventually we go into a very regulated system of farming whereby people would do anything if somebody told them this is a safer way to grow your food and survive. So thank you very much for having me. I hope you enjoyed this. And once again, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for having an insane archaeologist give an opening talk. Should I stay for questions? Or?